What's up, everybody? Welcome into another episode of Shout at Buffalo Bills Football Podcast. He's Ryan Talbot. I am Matt Parrino. And one of the most asked about offseason questions, Ryan, has been, can and should or will the Bills trade for Brandon Aiyuk, who is formally requested a trade in San Francisco? We are going to dive into all of that, our thoughts on all of that in a moment. But a couple of things. We got a couple of housekeeping items. And then I had a conversation quick off the cuff, 20 minutes, with Mike Ginnitti from SpotTrack.com. We went over everything from a contractual obstacles to how they would fit in his contract to what it means long-term on future caps if they were to hypothetically trade for Aiyuk and then give him a new contract. We talked about all of that. I'll play that conversation in a moment. But Ryan, we are coming back to Dorado on Park Ave in Rochester, August 4th, 2 p.m. until they kick us out. It is going to be the party of the summer for Shout. Wing Nuts is coming. They're bringing tons of wings. We cannot wait for this event on August 4th.
Yeah, pumped up. Last year was a great time despite some questionable weather. This year is going to be even better. Everyone that turned up last year, come back out again. If you didn't make it to last year's show and you're in Rochester for training camp, come on out and join us.
There is a link in the description below. Check that out. RSVP over on Facebook so you get it put in your calendar and you'll get a reminder the week of August 4th, right at the tail end of Bills training camp. If you're coming out for practice, or maybe you're not coming out for practice, you just want to make the drive, or you live in Rochester, it is going to be a party at Dorado. All right. Here we go. Without any further ado, here is my conversation with Mike Ginnitti from SpotTrack. Brandon Aiyuk, San Francisco 49ers, star wide receiver, requested a trade this week. And one of the most asked questions I get, Mike, is how can the Bills trade for Brandon Aiyuk? And we're going to get into all the details of what that would look like, the Bills' kind of cap situation this season, what it would be like to onboard Brandon Aiyuk and a new deal, all those kinds of things. And then also down the road, because this isn't just a move for 2024. If you trade for Brandon Aiyuk, you're giving him a new contract. It's going to affect future years. Before we get to too much down the road, first of all, thank you for joining us. How are you?
Good, man. It's a busy time of year. We're ramping back up. It's finally NFL week, right? I'm sure you guys have been going crazy trying to find some content this time of year.
Yes. And maybe that's why I'm so energetic about this, because it's like, it's something that we could really dive into. And, you know, there's definitely like different pockets in terms of the fan base wanting to either pursue a big move like this or kind of just chill and wait and see what it looks like with what they've accumulated this season with Josh Allen. But first things first, cost-wise, Brandon Aiyuk wants a new contract. That's the big sticking point with the 49ers. They don't seem eager to maybe match what he's looking for. What are you valuing him at? What does he want? And where do you think this ultimately lands with Aiyuk?
Yeah, it's tough. So number one, he's a $14.1 million player right now, right? That's his fifth-year option. The most important thing to understand is there's not a sign and trade in the NFL, right? Mm-hmm. And if there is, it's going to be the most rare unicorn situation that we've seen in decades, which means any team that's looking to do this has to have $14.1 million of cap space to acquire him at least for a second. And then they can honor that new contract and process it and be good to go. But that's step one. So that's problem one for Buffalo, right? Is finding $14 million worth of cap space to bring him in. In terms of the individual, look, there's a lot of numbers thrown around. I'll tell you what our math says. Our math says about $26 million a year. So 4 for 104 tacked onto that 14 million, about 5 for 125, 130 at the end of the day is probably fair value. That's not what he's looking for, right? He knows exactly what's happening. He knows where this wide receiver market has gone. We've seen players like St. Brown in Detroit, go north of 30 million. Philadelphia pumped 2 wide receivers north of 30 million these past couple of months. It's a very healthy top of the market right now. Is Brandon Aiyuk a top of the market wide receiver? I think that's the big question. The issue with this one specifically is there's so much going on with the 49er side of it, right? This is so little to do with Brandon Aiyuk, the player, and how good he is and what his actual ceiling might be. This is simply a very rigid strong front office in San Francisco saying, this was our plan. I'm sorry that you want double what you're making this year. You're worth it. We're not going to tell you you're not worth it. We're just not willing to pay that right now. We like the price we have you at. It's part of our system. It's part of our plan to go along with Brock Purdy and Debo and Kittle and a lot of other big contracts, obviously, on that Niners team. So, if he hits the open market in March, let's just fast forward to that. He's a $30 million wide receiver. We know that. We know where this is headed. But today, right now, he's not. And it's a fascinating dichotomy with what the team is willing to do, what the team wants to do. I just don't see a world where San Francisco actually wants to pay this player more than what he's being made right now.
The most interesting thing, too, is like how much has been made about their team being able to operate in its current Super Bowl window without him. Like, I don't know if they can add somebody that would give them the same bang for their buck. Obviously, I mean, he's one of the top wide receivers in the league by a lot of advanced metrics. Let me back you up just quickly, though, because you talked about the $14 million the Bills would have to get to just to onboard the contract. Is there any kind of maneuverability to say, if two teams agree on a trade and they say he's going to sign an extension and you can agree to that deal beforehand, have the Niners sign him to that deal and then make the trade so that cap hit is lower? Because an extension, I guess, ideally a lot of teams that want to do early extension with players is to lower that cap hit in that as it gets higher. Is there anything to that? Because I mean, depending on who you talk to, I mean, this is, not my expertise.
Yeah, no, I get it. And I wish there was a way, because I think it's a very powerful tool for the NBA and for other leagues that can do this. The problem is dead cap, right? Which no other league really operates in this manner. But the second you sign a player and give him a signing bonus, that signing bonus stays with that team. So if the 49ers were to sign him to this 4 for 105 with a $25 million signing bonus and then flip him to the Bills, well, that bonus has to stay with San Francisco. They're never going to do that. Right? They're never going to do that. There's no amount of draft compensation that would allow them to do it. The closest thing we had to this was the Giants with Odell Beckham Jr., who, like 8 months after extending him to his massive deal, just decided to give up on him and 4 years of signing bonus proration. Feels like minutes after giving him that contract. That's the closest thing we have, but that's obviously not a real sign and trade. So it'd have to be some really funky structure. High base salary this year that the Bills would take on and then flip to a signing bonus immediately. I'm not saying it's not doable. I'm saying it never happens. And I don't think in this scenario, either side would be willing to flex enough to make it work.
Mm-hmm. And then finally on this particular point, the Bills sitting at about, I think the last time I looked, about $7 million in cap space. What kind of levers do they have to pull? Could they even get to 14 if they wanted to just onboard what's there now?
It's real difficult. They've done a lot of dirty work this offseason, as we discussed in previous iterations here, man. Look, you could find it. You could make it work if you had to push some things down. But players like Josh and Von Miller and Matt Milano, your top cap hits, those are pretty much capped out, maxed out in terms of what kind of conversions you can pull on this. So you're really going to have to draw some straws to get to that number. I don't see this as a scenario where over the next couple of weeks, Buffalo would jump through the hoops to bring this player in, especially when there are maybe 4 to 5 other teams who can make it work right now and would have maybe the opportunity to offer better draft compensation back to San Francisco.
And then another thing that just popped into my head, just because like the money side of it from a trade perspective in the NFL, to your point, is so complicated. A lot of the fans that don't have a lot of understanding, that maybe don't go to websites like yours, that aren't maybe invested that much, but still want their team to be able to chase a guy like Brandon Aiyuk. Could you add in like a Dawson Knox, who has that cap hit, and then, the draft capital to make the money work?
That's how you have to do it, right? It's less about what can we maneuver to make this work. It's who are we sending back to shed the amount of cap space, to make San Francisco happy, and to not make a gigantic hole in our roster for 2024, because we're talking about two teams here who are top 5 Super Bowl contenders, right? That's the most difficult part about this, is that one hand really doesn't want to feed the other one too much, right? But it's got to be fair for both sides. It's why Pittsburgh and Washington and the Raiders just seem like much more sensible opportunities here, even though I'll just give you my 2 cents. I don't think San Francisco even takes phone calls on this guy over the next couple of weeks. I really think it's that set in stone.
Okay, so we've laid out all of the complicated factors to this season. I want to talk about future seasons and then what you think or forecast the Bills doing at this position money-wise in future years. Do you think, first of all, how much do you anticipate in cap space the Bills are going to have next offseason, and how likely do you think they use a portion of that to ink, especially if this thing doesn't go well this year, to ink a wide receiver to a big-time contract?
I really like how you opened this show with, is this just a wait and see mode for 2024? I really think it is, and in a positive way. It's not that they're sitting on their hands. They have done work at this position, right? Mm-hmm. Curtis Samuel's not a nobody. He's got a big hole to fill. I think he's got an opportunity to step in and be a big impact player. That's a 3-year contract. So even if we're looking at a 2-year deal, that's going to impact 2025. And obviously, the attention is going to turn on Keon Coleman here, which is, how quickly can he ramp up, or can he show enough to where next March this organization sees him as a breakout player and a position that, they won't have to supersede with any kind of free agent move at that level. But here's a name I don't hear enough, and I'm sure you talk about it constantly, Matt. This is a Dalton Kincaid season. I mean, that's what this is all about. This guy was not drafted to be a blocking tight end or to be any kind of supplementary piece. This guy was drafted to be your best option. He was drafted to be the Travis Kelce of this organization for the next 4 to 5 to 6 years at least. This is his year. This is the time that they have shed, the Stephon Diggs and the pieces that could take over his role. This is his moment. So to me, those are the names we're looking at. It's Curtis Samuel, it's Dalton Kincaid, certainly it's Keon Coleman. And if we're talking about them all in positive lights next March, then I don't think it's an area where you're going to allocate a lot of attention, a lot of free agent capital. It'll look a lot like this past season, where you're bringing in 1-year guys on low minimum cap hits just to see if they can stick as 4th or 5th options. And then, of course, you're going to throw a mid-round pick at the wide receiver probably every year, just because of how many guys you need in this roster and how much value you can find in the middle rounds with this position. But it's a big year for breaking out for Kincaid, and obviously for ramping up for players like Keon Coleman. Do I think they've done enough? I don't know. I don't know. Mm-hmm. The X factor is they have Josh Allen, and there's not many franchises that can say they have a quarterback that can elevate B players into A minuses. And I think that's exactly what Brandon Beane is hoping is happening over the next 3 to 4 months.
You have a bunch of pieces over on spottrack.com that do a great job of highlighting all these different, contract points of the offseason, in season. I think you had one up that kind of took a look towards 2025 free agency to get people kind of, their appetite started for what that's going to be like for the Bills. You pull up spottrack.com right now for the Bills in 2025, and that 2025 salary cap is looking at about $273 million on the books right now. We'll see where the cap goes and all that kind of stuff. Where do you project in terms of what the Bills can do to maybe get that number down, where you anticipate them to be around March? Just a rough estimate. Yeah,
based on projections, they're going to be over heading into February, and really most contending teams will be, because especially with a quarterback contract, you're continuing to push things down the line. It's just how things work. So for instance, I think Allen's cap hit for 2025 is like 60 million and change right now. Obviously that's going to be step one, is maneuvering that to down into the 30s, 35 million. And at that point, you'll be sitting with about 15 to 16 million of top 51 cap space, which is a good start, right? Mm-hmm. So you're a few cuts, a couple of cap conversions away from being around that 30 million mark, Matt, which is the healthy going rate for March 12th for a team that is pot invested to some degree, like Buffalo is. I think there are people that want that number to be in the 50s and 60s after all the work they did this past offseason, right? So many losses, so many free agent relinquishes. It's just not feasible with Josh's contract and with other things on the book, Deion Dawkins extensions. What they've done with Dawson Knox, essentially guaranteed through next year now as well. You'll lose Von Miller's contract. You'll lose some pieces that will help, but I don't anticipate a situation where Buffalo is going to be flush with cap space at any point in time in 2025. It's going to be a scenario where they're going to have to make a move to make a move, right? They're going to have to subtract something to add something. The good news, and I think you've done the work on this probably already, is we're talking about off-ball linebackers. We're talking about, second cornerbacks and maybe a second safety, positions that are super, super doable come March in free agency. Mm-hmm. That's the work that Brandon Beane has done, right? He is focused the difficult positions, the offensive linemen, the defensive linemen, to a certain degree, the wide receivers. He has made them good to go, financially speaking, in 2025. So now it's about backfilling or maybe making some sweeping big moves at positions that aren't going to break the bank in March when they won't have 40 to 50 million to spend.
I'm going to get you out of here in a minute, but while I have you, I wanted to get your impressions. Have you been watching the Hard Knocks series with the Giants? Did you watch the latest episode?
Yeah.
Yeah. For you, I mean, first off, like, what's it like watching this, the peek behind the curtain and really seeing what those days in free agency are really like for GMs and all the pro personnel staff?
It's great. I've had the opportunity to speak to some of these guys, off the cuff, off the record, things like that. And you can just tell, at least from my perspective, that they geek out on this stuff as much as probably I do, and to a certain degree to the fans do, right? They love it. They know how hard this is at times. What's great about Hard Knocks, and I think it's the best part about Hard Knocks, is it humanizes this stuff so much, right? I wear this nerdy business goggles constantly day to day, where these guys are numbers to me. And it's really important to understand just how difficult this stuff is. And especially with a player like Saquon Barkley, who has been so polarizing for 8 years of our lives, even back into the Penn State days, with the injuries and with the contract and with the draft position, just to see the back and forth and understand that so many people have different opinions on every single position, on every single decision that gets made throughout the offseason. And somebody just has to pull the trigger at some point and say, this is what we're doing. This is what our plan is going to be. It's enlightening to know that plan B, plan C, plan D come into focus so much. You know what I mean? Like, this is as complicated as we think it is. And that's, to me, the coolest part about seeing the inside guts of this.
I think, like, watching Joe, Shane, and Dable on there, knowing that they come from how the thing was built in Buffalo, it's really an extra interesting element because they saw what worked here, right?
Yeah.
Like, what they were trying to get of course, the quarterback. I think that was their one big mistake in these 2 years, is paying Daniel Jones. We could kind of talk that over and over again. But in terms of what Shane is trying to accomplish there, I think these 3 episodes, to me, have been exactly what Brandon Beane has always preached, right? Like, go out and get pass rushers, fortify your offensive line, see what you have in Daniel Jones, and then take another crack at the quarterback next year. I mean, they could be really positioned. You can't be positioned this year if you go out and do all this work and then also pay Saquon Barkley to then be in a situation next year to have the kind of, cap to continue to add and to maybe have some capital to go up and get a quarterback if you need one. I think they're doing a pretty good job. I also think John Mara is painted in, to me, the typical owner light, which is like just coming in like, I don't know, he's really popular. People really like him. It's like, yeah, no, but he's going to be a $13 million running back.
Yeah, no, that's exactly it, right? Everybody has their say, and it comes from a different angle, right? The owner is all about marketing and branding and putting jerseys on fans, and you're right. I get it. Look, I'm glad you said that. There's a lot of familiarity with what we're seeing, isn't there? It feels like we've been through this iteration, but in Buffalo, there's been a lot of Bills moves that have transferred over to the Giants directly. They're not really hiding it at this point in time. And look, you mentioned the quarterback stuff. Brian Dable's not being shy about it, and you knew he wouldn't be. Right. They made a run at Jaden Daniels. They wanted to go up there and get a guy this year because they know that that's the one mistake that they have to deal with throughout 2024. And contractually speaking, I've said it before, I'll say it here again. I think they're playing with hot water if they put Daniel Jones on that field, because there's a big, big injury guarantee on his 2025 salary that they want no part of. Right. They want to move on from this thing as soon as humanly possible. And if he re-injures that leg and he can't pass a physical next March 12th, they're in for a heap of trouble with the short term of that franchise.
Obviously, it's fun for us to bring you on here. This is the last one because you're a Bills fan. You follow the team closely, more so than most national folks. What's your boldest prediction? It doesn't even have to fall into that category, but what do you think is going to happen with this iteration of the Bills that maybe people aren't talking enough about right now, outside of Dalton Kincaid, which you mentioned earlier?
Yeah, that's a big one. The Bills will be a middle of the pack team, standings wise, and it'll be because the secondary is exposed. That's the one area I just think, and they probably know it, that they haven't shored up enough, right? They didn't go swinging big in the draft like some of us thought they were going to go up and do in the second round. They really are kind of trying to build internally, which has worked. It's worked for some teams. But I think we saw in Cleveland last year that was their downfall late in the season. And I think to a certain degree with Tre'Davious' injury, it bit Buffalo as well. And I don't think that they've bolstered that secondary enough yet. There's time, right? We've got training camp cuts and a lot of movement still with these 90-man rosters going down to 55 in a couple of weeks. So there's time. But to me, that's the one piece that keeps them from being maybe even a double-digit win team in 2024.
The only pushback, I love it, by the way. Like I like thinking outside the box because I've been very bullish on their secondary throughout the offseason because, I think that they like Tyler Rapp. They had him in his the building. I think Mike Edwards is a guy that, factors in. Then DeMar Hamlin, he's had a heck of a spring. Like I think that people forget that he played almost 1,000 snaps for them a couple of years ago. It wasn't all great, right? Like there was some good moments, some bad moments, some teachable moments, but he's older. He's been in the scheme. But I think Sean does a good job of coaching that up. I don't even have super high expectations for Cole Bishop. My bigger concern is the front, and especially at the edge position with Von Miller. Greg Rousseau and A.J. Epinesa, like both players, still haven't gone for 10 sacks. So that's a really interesting one to think about how their defense could potentially miss the mark. And now all of a sudden, if you don't have an offense that can carry the load, very interesting to see. This is going to be a fun season.
It's tough to argue your points. I'm a bit of a romantic when it comes to sports, right? I'm a big baseball guy, so that's just kind of built into my DNA. I think what Von Miller did in March contractually, and what he did to stick with this organization is going to change not only his mindset, but the mindset of the players around him. And because his optics were obviously as low as maybe they've ever been as an NFL player, right? We were finding ways that really didn't exist to get out of this contract in February and March. And he took it on himself to say, don't do this. I'll make this work for everybody. It's a 1-year deal. It's maybe the final deal of his career, right? And maybe the final season of his career. There's a big comeback story built into that, right? If you follow sports enough and you understand where we're going. So I have faith that maybe he and Rousseau and Epinesa can be enough. The players you mentioned in the secondary, I'll just finish with this, man. They're all solid. They're all in the upswing. They've all taken steps forward, but they are all undersized. Yeah. And in an 18-week season, and we saw, I think, all those players at least once or twice get nicked up, get concussed, get, obviously the worst of it. I just don't know if that's sustainable for the marathon season we have ahead of us.
It isn't, but then, in December, you just call up Micah Hyde and say you're ready for a 6-week run to a Super Bowl. I know that's what they kind of all got in the back of their mind, or at least Micah does still to this point. Talking to him at his charity event, you can still feel like he's going to just let it linger and see what happens. I'm sure he'll be at training camp at some point. Mike, this is so awesome. Thank you for doing this off the cuff here. I know it's a busy time. We're ramping up. Let everybody know what you got cooking, what they should expect, and where they can find all your work.
Yeah, we're like I said, we're ramping up these 90-man rosters for training camps to start this week. You kind of mentioned we have our big financial offseason recap live on Spotrac.com. I went team by team and basically just brought back every transaction, every move that was made. Some I even forgot about, right? Like Nico Collins got extended after one of the 1997 Houston Texans moves this offseason. So we went literally piece by piece throughout the entire league. So if you're looking for a refresher to everything that happened over the past 3 or 4 months, that's live on Spotrac.com. Appreciate it, man.
Beautiful. I will link that in the description. See everybody in the next episode. Take care of it. All right, Ryan, that was 20 minutes of great stuff from Mike. Shout out to him. Thank you so much for doing that. And now we really have to dive into, from the Bills' perspective, what our thoughts are on a potential trade, and Aiyuk specifically, in terms of how excited would you be if you're the Bills, if you're Brandon Beane, to acquire a player like Brandon Aiyuk, considering the price tag, the compensation, what we think that might be. Where do you land on Aiyuk as a trade target here before the season, during the summer, and then maybe even in season?
When you opened the show, you said, can they, will they, should they? Can they? Yes, they can. You can move some money around. You could trade a player. You could make the financials work in more time, more cases than not. Will they, should they? No, and no. I like Brandon Aiyuk. I feel like Brandon Aiyuk is actually underrated in terms of the player that he is. he is on an offense that I don't think utilizes him enough. I think he's a very, very good player. But the Bills had to do a lot to tear down their roster, so to speak, this past offseason to get cap compliant. And they would kind of find themselves again in the same boat sooner rather than later if they were to make a move for a guy like Brandon Aiyuk. Aiyuk, like I already said, extremely talented, Matt, but he's on the books for already a good chunk of change for the fifth-year option, and he's going to want, I would think, $30+ million on average per season at wide receiver. And for me, that's just not feasible for the Bills. It makes them have to cut elsewhere down the road or get more creative. It might lead to other holes elsewhere on this roster. I like the player a lot, but I feel like going into this offseason, knowing full well that they were probably going to move on from Stephon Diggs, I think internally they had a good feeling that was going to happen. Knowing that Gabe Davis was going to leave in free agency, they went out and they added players that they thought would be good for Joe Brady's offense. They bring in Curtis Samuel, someone that's played in the system, still only 27 years old, close to Brandon Ayuk's age, actually, when you look at that and compare that. They have Khalil Shakir, who they think is an ascending player coming in for year 3. They draft Keon Coleman. They bring in other guys, MVS, Chase Claypool, and company. It's not the sexiest list of names at wide receiver. I think anyone can admit that. But they're happy with the room based on what I think Joe Brady wants to do.
I think I want to peel this back to, first of all, the compensation that you'd have to give up to even get the right to pay a Brandon Aiyuk. And so, we could use the most recent example, like the AJ Brown trade, a guy that was trending for a big deal. And the Tennessee Titans traded him to the Philadelphia Eagles, who paid him a massive contract at the time. And it's amazing how quickly those numbers dwindle as some of these new deals are coming in. But, fresh off of Justin Jefferson getting $35 million, I mean, Brandon Aiyuk, while maybe not putting up the numbers of a Jefferson, is going to be looking for a contract in the $30 million per season range. And to me, when you're paying your quarterback with the Bills, what the Philadelphia Eagles had going for them when they traded for AJ Brown is that Jalen Hurts was on a rookie contract. And now next year's cap hit for Josh Allen, which is going to be worked on. I mean, it's a $60 million cap hit now. They're going to restructure it. They're probably going to get it down to $35 million. They're going to get a ton of cap space. Mike was just talking about the fact that the Bills, after doing a couple of moves, will have about, 30-ish million, which is where you want to kind of be to start your offseason. And that's all well and good, but you're putting resources in a spot that, you got to pay the player, but you also got to pay with the draft capital that you've kind of put together here. And AJ Brown went for a first and a third. If I'm John Lynch in San Francisco, I'm looking for more. I'm looking for a first and a second for the right to get a player that we think in San Francisco, if you're John Lynch, we can't live without. That's why this is reaching this point, isn't it? Because they want the value of that $12 million on the final year of Ayuk's contract. And they know the value that he brings to that offense. I was listening to the Ringer show. Shout out to the folks over there that do that show. I don't want to screw up any of their names, so I'm not going to say them. But Stephen Ruiz is one of them, Nora Princiati, and I can't remember the other host. Ben Solak does some stuff over with them. I'm going to look it up now because I don't.
Now it's going to bother you.
It's going to bother me, and he does a really good job. I read him over there, and his name is escaping me right now. Oh, gosh. What do you think it is, Ryan?
I honestly have no idea. I remember Ruiz there was bashing the Bills early on in his tenure. He's over the last few years, that has not been the case, but he was anti-Bills for a few years there.
Yeah, it's funny because I feel like over the years, the different iterations of this podcast, it was way back. It was for The Athletic. It was, or he's now at The Athletic, was Robert Mays. And then it was Kevin Clark, who have both now moved on. I've liked all the iterations of the show. I can't find it, so I'm just going to move right now. But in terms of, they were talking about it on the show about when what they do, the motions, the work they do with Christian McCaffrey along the line of scrimmage, When all that goes out the window on, say, a 3rd and long, and you just need a guy to win against the defense, I mean, that's when Brandon Aiyuk really shines. And so, like, they know probably that if they remove him from their situation, their offense isn't going to be as good as it can be. And they're in a Super Bowl window, right? They're not paying their quarterback yet. And that's another piece of this. Like, paying Brandon Aiyuk when they're already playing Deebo Samuel. And then, in December, we're going to start talking about Brock Purdy, if he has another good season, about paying him. Those are the roster gymnastics that you got to constantly be playing if you're a general manager. Here's the part of it for the Bills. So I mentioned the compensation, right? So if you give up a first and, say, a second, or a first, third, and fifth, whatever the compensation will be back, why not go out and do the due diligence on the receiver position and find the next Brandon Aiyuk in the draft? Get that at least 3 years of cost control on the rookie contract. It seems like a better use of resources. And, oh, by the way, like I talked about with Mike, they drafted Dalton Kincaid in the first round last year. I think part of the reason that Stephon Diggs is no longer on this roster is because they want to see what this thing looks like built around Dalton Kincaid. You bring Brandon Aiyuk into the mix here, say la vida that. Like that, you're
Right.
now going to be right back in the situation you were before with a first-round player in Dalton Kincaid and a high-paid wide receiver that you have to force the ball to. And I'm not saying that can't work. Brandon Aiyuk is obviously thrived in a situation where Christian McCaffrey eats and Deebo Samuel eats and George Kittle eats. I'm not saying it can't happen. I'm just saying there might be the inclination within the Bills building to see what this thing looks like, handing the keys over to Dalton Kincaid and, to a lesser extent, James Cook, like we talked about earlier in the week.
Yeah, absolutely. And a team like the Bills, a playoff contender, Super Bowl contender, they'd probably have to give up more resources because the 49ers would probably sit there and say, well, a first-round pick might be in the late 20s. Second-round pick's going to be in the 50s. And then all of a sudden you're still not getting very good value. So unless it's one of the teams that you expect to potentially be in the bottom of the league, one of the top picks in the draft, you don't move on from Brandon Aiyuk. You figure out a way to make it work for this season, and then you see where you're at the end of that year. So Aiyuk in general, in theory, it sounds great, but for a team like the Bills, it's so difficult to make that happen. And to your point, it would be great to be able to go out and draft a guy like Aiyuk in the draft, and that's why you take swings on players like that. Obviously, the hit rate at wide receiver ebbs and flows in terms of the percentage, but it's very hit and miss. There have been a lot of high draft picks that haven't panned out in recent years, and a lot of middle round, even late round guys that have. So it's a total crapshoot. That's the beauty of the draft. But the Bills, they took a shot on a guy like Khalil Shakir in round 5 a few years ago, and he's an ascending player now. They're able to finally get Curtis Samuel here into Buffalo, a guy that fits Joe Brady's system, former second-round pick, a guy that's never had good quarterback play. They think that he's going to fare well. But the main point is, like you said, this offense, in terms of the passing game, is going to run through Dalton Kincaid. And if you throw in a semi-one or a true number one receiver into that mix, like you said, everything changes. And at this point, I don't think that's what Joe Brady wants. I think Brady has in his mind what this offense is going to look like, and it's feeding Dalton Kincaid the ball. It's getting some of those top receivers their fair share of looks, leaning on James Cook in the run game, and being a little bit more balanced as an entire offense. And it becomes more of a struggle if you do add a player like Aiyuk.
Deontay Lee, that's my bad, was the third member of the Ringer podcast trio who do a great job. Shout out to those guys. I got 2 other points on this, and it's tough because, like, I think Brandon Aiyuk has been a good teammate. I think he's been a good soldier in that offense, dealing with the fact that there are a ton of mouths to feed. And you're right, he probably could eat a ton more in a different offense. And for the most part, he never seems to be a complainer. The postseason, sunglasses on, feathery deal that he was wearing, press conference where he was asked if he wanted to be there, and he said, yeah, if it's the right thing. It's just, I didn't like the vibes. And to me, if you're the Bills, you're not really looking to add any of those kinds of components back into your locker room, because in a lot of ways, that was one of the likely reasons that Stephon Diggs is no longer in the locker room. And listen, I don't think that necessarily Diggs was ever a distraction or overtly did anything to that degree where, to live up to these diva headlines that have been written about him. But at the same time, how many times were there negative headlines happening around Stefon Diggs, negative questions happening about his brother tweeting about Josh Allen, or, the mini camp debacle, just stuff that can be a disturbance inside the building. AJ Brown, they go out and they trade for him. Worked great, right? They went to the Super Bowl that first year. They paid him. He was a bona fide superstar wide receiver, really changed the complexion of their offense. Jalen Hurts needed that, though. He was at the point of his career where he needed that player. Like Josh Allen needed Stefon Diggs in 2020. But this is 2024 Josh Allen. And what happened 1 year after all of that happened with Jalen Hurts the first year, all the success, all the kumbaya and the love? They were arguing on the sidelines all the time. AJ Brown all of a sudden became a bit of a distraction. And listen, I don't think Brandon Aiyuk, I don't want to put that on him, but I don't think it's worth risking any chemistry issues
right
on the other side of a potential $105 million contract.
No, absolutely. And that's the unknown of it all. I mean, he doesn't seem like the type of player necessarily that would cause those types of issues. But you don't know the player well enough in terms of if he comes over here, yeah, he would get paid no matter where he goes. But if he's not the focal point, if his targets are not where he wants them to be, does it create some disturbances? Does it create some issues? There are a lot of players that want the ball in their hands, and there's nothing wrong with it. That's the sign of a superstar player generally. But for the Bills, spreading the ball out is what helped them late in the season, giving looks to different guys. There were games where, Gabe Davis had a few nice stat lines. There were games where he had no catches, no targets. There were games where James Cook was leading the way on the ground. Performances by Dalton Kincaid late in the year where he looked great, and Shakir. So it seems like causing mismatches in terms of week by week with versatile pieces and a lot of versatility in general is what they're looking for with this system. And as good as Aiyuk is, because of the cap situation, because of the roster that they have in place, it just does not seem like an ideal fit.
And here's the other thing about the compensation that you have to give back to the 49ers. If you're willy-nilly willing to trade a first-round pick, why not do it in the draft next year with all the draft capital that you have to get aggressive and actually go up and get a guy that you think, maybe the next Malik Neighbors or the next Roma Dunze, whoever that ends up being in next year's draft? Wouldn't that make more sense than having to give up the assets and then have to, literally pay a guy top dollar, top of the market dollar? It doesn't seem to make a lot of success. And I do think the Bills have given themselves a little wiggle room to where they can see how this goes early in the season, see how it goes throughout training camp in the preseason, the first couple of weeks. And if they have to make a move, they can make a move. And maybe it's not as high as a Brandon Aiyuk, but maybe there's this year's version of Jerry Jeudy every trade deadline, right? Like Jerry Jeudy was on the move, Odell Beckham Jr. a few years ago from the Giants to the Cleveland Browns. That type of move to me makes a little bit more sense, where maybe you don't have to foot the entire bill and fitting, trying to make the kind of cap space to get up to 14 million when you're sitting there at 7 million right now. I just don't think that that's very feasible.
No. And like you said, trade deadline, good players get traded all the time, whether it's wide receiver. We saw last year the cornerback position, the Bills getting a Rasul Douglas. Guys get moved at the deadline when teams feel like they're not contending or they're not going to contend. The Bills can pick someone up in that situation if need be, where the alternative is paying a small fortune to Brandon Aiyuk, who may be very deserving of that contract. But where the Bills are with Josh Allen's salary, with some of these other salaries that they have on the books, it just doesn't seem to make a lot of sense. Like you said, if you're going to give up draft capital, do it in the draft. Get a guy that you have on a cost control contract for 4 years, then you have that fifth-year option as well. Aiyuk is a great player. I think he could end up landing in a great spot. Maybe it's Pittsburgh. Maybe it's the Commanders. Those are two teams that have been linked to him. But maybe the 49ers just say, hey, listen, our plan is our plan. And we've seen other great players across this league sit out to start a year. But once those fines start adding up, they always come back. And we're going to count on you to be here when it matters. And we're going to try to make one more run at the Super Bowl before we have to make some really tough decisions in terms of what does a Brock Purdy contract looks like. Do they move on from Deebo Samuel? I just think that the 49ers, one, would be wise to play this as long as they can, keeping him on the roster for their own sake, because like you said, this is a Super Bowl contending team, and they're not going to get better trading a player like that right now. Now, draft pick wise, yes, they could set themselves up nicely, but that's a completely different matter.
Yeah, and then you lose Aiyuk, and then Brock Purdy takes a step back, and now you don't even have an option at quarterback, and you have to start that whole process again. And we know last time they had to draft a quarterback, how poorly that went with Trey Lance. So a bunch of different problems. I think the best course here is just for the 49ers to say, you're under contract, you got to show up. We'll deal with this after the season, but you got to show up and play. And listen, they have a lot of vets on that team. The McCaffreys of the world, Debo's, on the other side of the ball, in Bosa. I think, Greenlaw in the linebacking room, like once you get to the season, I think a lot of that stuff goes away. And, it's unfortunately just part of the game of football. You want to see guys get paid. Like, Brandon Aiyuk is the top talent. He's looking to get, cash in and, at the time when he's able to cash in. But it's tough from the team perspective. All right, we're going to get out of here on that note. I just wanted to hit a little bit on this after my conversation with Mike, who, shout out to him again. You can find the link to his offseason recap, preseason primer in the description below. Become an insider right now. You're going to want to get locked in. We're 1 week away from training camp. The training camp insider line is going to be buzzing like never before. 716-528-6727. Text that number or go to joinsubtext.com/shoutbuffalobills. Get yourself the 2-week free trial, $3.99 a month after that. The Shout Text line is brought to you by Carrie C. Beyer, attorney with the law offices of Francis M. Litro, located at 237 Main Street in Buffalo, New York. If you or someone you know is seriously injured, give him a call. 716-852-1234 or check out litrolaw.com. Ryan Talbot, final word.
Yeah, final word. Brandon Aiyuk, in terms of the talent, makes a lot of sense for Bills fans to want, but financially and based on what this roster looks like, just is not for the Bills at the end of the day.
For Ryan Talbot, I'm Matt Parrino. We will see you next time, everybody. Have a great night.